2. Medicine Men. Having read a book about medicine men, I asked some of the older men about them. There were several practicing medicine men on the reservation, or so someone in the Indian Service Hospital had told me. The comment amused these men. From their perspective, there were no medicine men then on the reservation, only fakers. Thomas Premo originally, and George Prentice had a background in family training as Indian medical practitioners. I knew Tom, an elder in the church, especially well. He could give an... Go away. Phone. With your annoying phoneness. Let's try that. Premo. Thomas Premo originally, and George Prentice had a background in family training as Indian medical practitioners. I knew Tom, an elder in the church, especially well. He could give an Indian identification for every plant I ever saw there. If it had any medical uses, he could cite them. He knew about a rare one or two with hallucinatory properties. These latter he never discussed in front of other Indians or children. True medicine men, it was said, had given way to the white man's doctor because he knew more than the... blah, blah, blah. True medicine men, it was said, had given way to the white man's doctor because he knew more about... True medicine men, it was said, had given way to the white man's doctor because he knew more than the Indian practitioner. This surprised me, but I soon came to know the hard-headed realism of most of the older men. They had no loyalty to the older ways per se. The white man's gun was far superior to the bow and arrow. Why not his medicine also? Many of the older men regarded with contempt the romanticism about the Indian past shared by many whites as well as by younger and radical Indians. They did not identify their Indianness. They did not identify their Indianness in terms of artifacts, and it annoyed them when others did. Commissioner Collier was regarded with disgust by many Indians because he wanted to Indianize the Indians. The older men believed that Collier was a fool who would lead young Indians astray. At one reservation in the southwest, as I recall, an old Indian told Collier that they were ready to go back to the old ways when the white man returned to the spinning wheel and the covered wagon. They saw nothing exclusive about the benefits of the white man's civilization. These were advantages available and beneficial to all. I don't know what that meant. Strange. No one could have been more unsentimental about the Indian past than these men. In one notable exception, the Paiute leader, Paddycap, son of Chief Paddycap, idealized the past, but others held his claims as a ploy in demands for more land for the Paiutes. So the Shoshones alleged, and a tricky wee Shoshone way. Tricky wee Shoshone. So the Shoshones alleged, and some Paiutes admitted. In brief, these old men liked modern conveniences and advances, including modern medicine. They spoke respectfully of the old-time medicine man's knowledge. They knew that the agency doctors were often inferior to the doctors. Okay, let's try it again. This time in English. They knew that the agency doctors were often inferior to the doctors outside of the reservation, although the nurses were usually quite good. All the same, they recognized and appreciated the advantages of modern medical practice, of nurses and hospitals. A stay in hospital was a treat. Their respect for surgery was great. People who despised such things were fools, and the old men were annoyed that anyone might suspect them of such foolishness. What then are the so-called medicine men practicing at the time? Most were peyote leaders. Peyote was administered as a holy healing medicine. It tended to paralyze the digestive tract, or at least deaden it to pain, I was told. The patient usually felt no pain and assumed that he was being healed. If the patient grew weak and death seemed certain, the peyote healer would become indignant at any questioning by the patient or his family. A quarrel would ensue, and the healer would say angrily, "Take him to the white man's hospital and see if they can do any better." The patient would be taken to the hospital and soon would die, confirming the healer's prediction. The hospital staff dreaded the coming of the peyote drug patients. They could usually identify them by their distended stomachs. They could usually identify them by balamba. They could usually identify them by their distended stomachs, in which undigested food piled up. In which undigested food piled up because peyote hinders digestion. They could not refuse such patients, but knew that most would die in their rooms and gave the hospital a bad reputation. There was another kind of practitioner. How deep his roots were in Indian history I do not know. Discussion of these men was avoided unless no one else was present. These medicine men, if they could be called such, and Tom Premo and George Prentice simply shook their heads at the idea, I would call occultist. They had strange powers I cannot explain. One of them, AC, could pick up a rattlesnake, chant to it, hang it around his neck and not be bitten. AC could do things that baffled any normal or scientific explanation. What I do know is that AC's powers were of no advantage to him. His eyes never seemed to focus on anyone to whom he spoke. He could not function too well and never looked normal. His wife and children also had a strangeness about them. Like other Indians, he lived in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor, but his was a life more abject than of almost all others. My conclusion was this. My conclusion was this. Demonic forces are more able to manifest themselves where the power of Christ is either new or absent. The earthly ministry of our Lord quite obviously precipitated demonic activities unprecedented in previous biblical history. In the 1920s and 1930s, missionaries who had entered new areas of Asia and Africa talked at times of strange and demonic manifestations. Some who were physicians simply shook their heads in amazement at their bizarre experiences. As Christianity waned in the US after World War II, there was a revival of occultism and evil manifestations of the kingdom of darkness. Some things I witnessed or heard of on the reservation were not amenable to any natural cause. reality was obviously far broader than my knowledge or experience. What I did know was that these strange powers emphatically did no good to those who used them. People such as AC, and there were several, but I knew him best, and he was not hostile to me because I helped his children, had unusual powers, and they themselves were the primary victims of their practices. I stayed away from such men. Tom Premo quietly told me that they were not good people to know or to offend. Men such as AC were Indian in a fanatical way. They sought to blot out the world of the white man. I have often wondered if that is not an aspect of the demonization of our own cultures. Wow. Wow. I have often wondered if this is not an aspect of the demonization of our own culture. When men turn their backs on Christian civilization, see only the evil in it, and try to abstract biblical faith and morals from themselves and the world, are they not courting the demonic? AC's world had no room in it for anything good. The errors of the old-time medicine men were respected by the heirs of the old The heirs of the old-time medicine men respected the old practice, and so were very favourable to the white man's medical practice. Ahui's occult practitioners had no connection with the old-time medicine men. Tom Premo said, in effect, that the occultists had no history in medicine, yet they pretended to the deepest roots in the care of health. But their roots drew from a well alien and dangerous to man's creaturely condition. Okay, well, that's me. I think I'm going to call it a night for tonight. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed that. Some very relevant stuff, clearly. Especially in that last little quote. The death of desire to do away with quote-unquote white culture, aka Christian culture, is the desire for the demonic. Okay, and that cheery note. Cheerio. Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. Hello folks, this is Nathan, and here we are. Chapter 3, so I'm going to hit the record button, and let's go. Funerals, 3. 3. Funerals. Funerals are interesting because they are so conservative and even reactionary in their meaning to people. A couple planning to marry may have bizarre ideas as to how the nuptials should be conducted. One can persuade them to conform to the church's norm or else seek another pastor. In funerals, however, the family usually follows established patterns. Burials are sometimes in a family plot several states away, in what was once a home area. And people often do not think about a funeral until a death occurs in the family. I was summoned at every death on the reservation, Christian or non-Christian, Paiute or Shoshone, peyote or non-peyote users. The older Indians felt that Christians have more to say about death and the afterlife than anyone else, certainly more than their own sages. Cemeteries are Christian inventions, as I saw it. Let's just bump the volume up a bit. The gain, should I say? Cemeteries are Christian inventions, as they saw it. In earlier years, the Paiutes and Shoshones buried their dead near their campsite, wherever they might be, wherever that might be, wherever that might be. Buried their dead near the camps, wherever that might be. If hunger, a battle, or an epidemic killed off a number of people at once, they were all buried at that site. It was not regarded as holy ground, as some claim, but evil ground because they feared the spirits of the dead. For these Indians, the dead resented the fuller life of the living. As spirits, they had only a half-life, and they turned envious of their own family members and could harm them. Thorny branches of wild rose bushes were immediately laid over the body at the moment of death to prevent the man's spirit from crawling out of the body to cause trouble. The Christians laughed at the custom and saw it as revelatory of the hold of the past on some families, only marginally under Christian influence. On some reservations, I was told, a house would be burned if someone died in it. Under Roosevelt, this caused the Federal Housing Administration much trouble, because a house built with a federal loan would go up in smoke and payments would cease. At Aughey, as death approached, some families protected their cabin by moving a dying person into a tent pitched outside. This would be done even in 0-degree weather with snow on the ground. There was no cruelty in this. The dying person would be kept well bundled and the tent warmed. There would be a dinner for all who came to the funeral. Usually a cow was butchered. The meat was prepared outside the house and served there, so the meat was prepared outside the house and served there to the many that came. There was a stylized mourning, a wailing beside the body. The older people, especially the women, were very good wailers. I do not say that critically. Each death, especially of an elderly person, meant for them the passing of a familiar way of life. Women were both the most conservative as well as the most liberal members of the community. In a way that few men did, they resented the passing of the old order and felt most helpless as the old certainties declined. On the other hand, the young woman revelled. On the other hand, the young woman revelled in sexual freedom. There were penalties for adultery in the old days, such as cutting off a woman's nose. I knew one such woman. She was not a pretty sight. It was a major penalty that discouraged lovers. But the husband had to see his wife in that condition. But the husband had to see his wife in that condition from then on. In those days, it was rare for an older woman to be an alcoholic. Many older men were, and the young men and women more so. Older women were disciplined workers, the mainstay of most non-Christian families. The passing of the old ways distressed them. They were also concerned about others. Jenny Aughey's daughter, Judy, herself an elderly woman, a Christian with a superb zest for life and a rich sense of humour, married while I was there a young man between 18 to 25 years old. He was tubercular and had a very limited lifespan ahead. He gave Judy a husband in his person, and she gave him a wife who cared for him tenderly. He gave Judy a husband in his person, and she gave him a wife who cared for him tenderly, kept him happy, and provided a robust atmosphere which was remarkable. Indians did not share in the American conventions regarding the marriage of an old woman to a young man. Funerals brought the past to mind. At times an old Indian would speak about the past. Not long after my arrival on the reservation, a funeral dinner, one old Indian, a gracious and handsome man, summoned all present, speaking in Shoshone, to return to the wolf cult. The wolf, he said, was their true father. Even the white man's science, he went on, and the white man's schools taught that men were descended from animals. To him, their evolutionary dogma was a vindication of the ancient Indian faith. He saw the degeneration setting into the white man's culture as exemplified by the personnel of the U.S. Indian Service, and he wanted a return to some kind of animism. Such an emphasis was mainly a dying echo of the past. I conducted all the funerals because the people wanted me to. A sermon, however brief, was the central part of the service for them. Most services were held at the graveside. I only recall one in which an Elko mortuary was used. The family prepared the body. Friends dug the grave. Friends, after the service, shoveled dirt onto the coffin and filled the excavation. I always lent a hand with the spade work. For one thing, in the winter, it was a way of keeping warm. It was also appreciated by all present. All the cemeteries at Aughey are the work of Christians, and the older men knew and appreciated this fact. They recognized that Christianity had a compelling word on the meaning of life and death. Instead of a fear of the dead, it required a respect. In those days, this Christian perspective was not taken for granted. Once in a while, a man would visit isolated places in Idaho and northern Nevada to show old movies, a source of meager depression income. Usually, these were old cowboy and Indian films. Usually, these were old cowboy and Indian films. The young Indians in the audience would whoop enthusiastically as the Indians charged a wagon train, and then groan as the wagon train's defenders drove off the horsemen. On a few occasions, a comedy would be shown which would include a ghost and maybe a frightened black man. What was impressive to the audience was that the hero did not fear the ghost, and that a ghost story was something comical to the white man. Little things like this were very telling to the Indians, and important for them in seeing the difference between the Indian world and the Christian world. At every turn they saw the differences. One telling fact to them was the indifference of virtually all Indian Service personnel to Christianity. To them, it meant that Washington, D.C. and all it represented was alien to Christianity. Since they associated Christianity with the white man, it meant to them that the white leadership treated Christianity with disrespect. This was difficult for them to understand. For them, a people and a religion were inseparable. The attitude of the Indian Service told them of the white man's abandonment of Christianity. Then, why was I there? What was the white man trying to do? The Indians were familiar in earlier years with cast-off clothing being passed on by white families to the Indians. Were the whites also passing on their cast-off religion? John Paradise, a Shoshone, subscribed to the Elko, Nevada daily newspaper. He enjoyed reading, and he was familiar with several periodicals. I spent the better part of a day trying to explain to him that Christianity was not the white man's religion, that some white men were atheists, agnostics, or members of various non-Christian religious groups. Agnostics, or members of various non-Christian religious groups. Christianity, I told him, was not an ethnic faith, but represented a separate realm, a kingdom of universal scope. The world and the United States, I told him, will be judged by Christ the King, whose realm is under none and over all. Finally, he grasped the point and was amazed. In his earlier understanding, everything came out of the natural order, but now he had heard something new and amazing. For the first time, he understood the thrust of biblical faith as an interruption of nature. To him that was an amazing and nearly inconceivable thing. His view of the natural order included concepts that a scientist would have found untenable. All the same, John Paradise and the scientists would have agreed on the ultimacy of the natural order. Many of the older Indians talked of the parallels to Genesis in their myths. The flood and Noah were in particular important to them, and they explained many things in terms of a universal flood. At the same time, the flood and other events were all seen as aspects of the natural order. The world was full of supranormal things, but for them, empty of the God of Scripture. They were ready to avoid Christ and the supernatural, as was Charles Darwin. All right, folks, well, that was the end to that chapter. Not going to gild the lily. I should really not include this in the video, but I know you love it. Alright folks, so we're going to hopefully see you in chapter 4. Be there or be oval. Okay folks, here we are, chapter 4. Hit the record button and let's go. 4. Power. One aspect of Indian life has remained on my mind nearly 50 years after I began my work at Auhi. I was reminded of it again in reading Patrick Marnham's So Far From God by the observation, quote, "The Indians originally venerated Cortes as a god. They respected strength. They were ruled by very powerful gods, and a man who could overthrow those would be acknowledged." End quote. The Paiute and Shoshone Indians had a like respect for Paiute, Shoshone, Paiute? No, Paiute. Paiute? Paiute. Pretty sure it's Paiute. What say you? The Paiute and Shoshone Indians had a like respect for power. This attitude may have changed since my departure, but I question whether it has, although Christian Indians did not share it. An old man told me of an incident which had occurred when he was a boy, not too many years after the Civil War. His father was with the army. Among the army scouts was a young Apache about 15 years old. One night, while eating dinner, some of the soldiers teased him about his youth. The young Apache left the campsite in quiet anger. He reappeared at breakfast the next morning, carrying the heads of 2 of the Indians whom the unit had been pursuing, which he tossed into the circle of men without a word. He was never teased again. Because of their respect for power, the Indians had power. Respect for power. The Indians had an ambivalent view of the white man. His power, numbers, and scientific achievements were very much appreciated. Were very much appreciated. What have I done? Were very much appreciated. The Indian might not like the white man, but he respected him. Pragmatic realism was very much a part of these Indians' thinking. Owing to this respect for power, there was a corresponding disrespect for powerlessness. The clearest expression of this was in their attitude towards blacks. In those years, blacks were not numerous in the West, and they were uncommon in small towns and rural areas. As an example of the Indians' attitude, I can cite their abuse of a black man who worked in the Rio Tinto copper mine. The miner felt close to the Indians as a fellow minority people. The Indian miners played along with this. The black miner asked for an invitation to the reservation during duck hunting time, and the Indians agreed. When he arrived, all eagerness and happy friendliness, he was told... Oh, hang on a second. I'm gonna get this guy out, dear. The black miner asked for an invitation to the reservation during duck hunting time, and the Indians agreed. When he arrived, all eagerness and happy friendliness, he was told to sneak towards the pond on all fours through the brush to avoid frightening the ducks. The Indians well knew that the area was full of rattlesnakes. The black man crept quietly towards the pond until he came almost face to face with a rattlesnake. Providentially, he jumped up and back so rapidly that he was not bitten. The Indians doubled over. The Indians. The Indians doubled up with laughter. The black man quickly understood the situation, got in his automobile and left. He soon came to realize that no Indian would regard him as an equal, whereas some white men would, and most white men would, and most white men, and most white men would be reasonably fair to him. This duck pond episode was often retold by the Indians with a great deal of laughter. To them, blacks were inferior, and their feelings did not count. One Indian said, "We fought against the white man, and we lost, but the blacks never fought." He saw whites as superior, and the Indian as a close second. The black man had not fought, to his knowledge, and so did not count. In some areas, blacks intermarried with Indians. I am of the opinion that this usually occurred where blacks fought fought back against enslavement and escaped. Such defiance would have earned them the Indians' respect. The Indian attitude was not in terms of race or colour, but of warrior standards. The tribes I knew had seen whites and Chinese join them in previous generations. The Chinese were men who escaped from railroad construction gangs. What mattered was a man's exhibition of the traits of the fighter and the hunter. This veneration of power was very notable to me, especially because I saw the same characteristic become very prominent in the white American culture by the 1960s. One aspect of this was the rise of groupies, girls who eagerly submitted sexually to power figures in the popular culture. Popular musicians, athletes, film and television stars have since then been pursued with intensity by women, young and not so young, who feel it is an honour to be used sexually by them. Frankly, nothing I ever saw among the Indians matched in intensity this power worship that became so prevalent in the United States. If the omnipotent and all-gracious God of Scripture is not worshipped, men will pursue their adoration of power in other ways. The groupie is one among many such forms of submission to power. While I was among these Indians, their use of peyote in some limited circles was condemned by other Indians as well as by most whites. One of the illusions created by peyote was a release from human limitations into a blissful euphoria. It gives illusions of power. Non-peyote Indians regarded the users as low-class Indians in those days. Non-peyote Indians regarded the users as low-class Indians in those days and despised them. They resented the fact that some university scholars treated the peyote people as true or good Indians. They point out that the use of peyote is modern and came into the country from Mexico. They were, on the whole, accurate in seeing the peyote users as low-class Indians. While there were a few exceptions, all too many of the peyote people were misfits of the tribes were the misfits. All too many of the peyote people were the misfits of the tribes. Peyote gave them the illusion of having power and wisdom. It is not an accident, I believe, that as groupies have become common in white America, so true has common in white America, so too has drug addiction. Again, it is a part of the quest for association with power, and drugs provided the necessary illusion. God's being is more than simply power. He is justice, love, grace, law, and far more. The Christian's worship of God is not the bare adoration of power, but the worship of the supreme, ultimate, and absolute person, God. As a result, there is no warping of the believer's life by undue emphasis on one particular trait as against the whole person. While American culture has far outstripped that of the Indians in its worship of power, while it's white. White American culture has far outstripped that of the Indians in its worship of power, with deadly results. Alrighty. Hope you appreciated that. That was chapter 4. Hope to see you, chapter 5. Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.